Volvo was one of the first car companies in the world to commit to an entirely electrified future. And even though there may be companies out there that produce more electric vehicles than Volvo, very few car companies produce more electrified vehicles as a percentage of their total sales than Volvo. In California, for instance, about half of all new Volvos sold in this state are plug-in hybrid vehicles. And for 2022, a larger portion of Volvo's sales portfolio is moving over to at least mild hybridization. Known as the B5 engine and the B6 engine in Volvo's lineup, you'll find them not just in the 2022 S90, but also the XC60 and the S60 in the United States. For some reason, the XC40 and V60 cross-country are not getting the mild hybrid system just yet, but expect those to come at some point soon. And elsewhere in the world, you can get the mild hybrid system in those Volvos. Volvo's electrification initiative is arguably the most aggressive in the automotive industry as far as traditional auto manufacturers go. But Volvo is a very pragmatic company when it comes to engineering, and that's why Volvo is taking electrification in steps. The first step in the progress was to make a series of plug-in hybrid vehicles that were attractive and attainable and readily available. They weren't limited in production in any way. And that's why Volvo is selling so many plug-in hybrids around the world. Rather than making the plug-in hybrid a compliance vehicle with a really tiny range and making it the cheapest model in the lineup, Volvo decided to make plug-in hybrids desirable by making them the most powerful, fastest Volvos while also being the most fuel efficient and giving you an electric range. The next step in Volvo's electrification process was to create a series of mild hybrids that will eventually become the base engines across the entire lineup. So given time, every Volvo will be at least a mild hybrid. Then of course we have some full hybrid models that are currently available only in Europe and other world markets, not in the United States just yet. For some folks out there, Volvo's plans are an electric revolution, and for some folks you could best describe it as an electric evolution, because it's going to take some time until Volvo has completely canceled the gasoline engine in their vehicles, but it's not going to take as long as some other car companies you might think about. The S90 occupies an interesting place in Volvo's lineup. This is the flagship Volvo sedan, but it's not as big as the flagship sedans in the Mercedes, the BMW, or the Audi lineup, because Volvo chooses not to compete in the full-size sedan space. Instead, this is theoretically more of a mid-size sedan, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. We have a slightly tweaked front-end grille since the S90 first launched, the distinctive Thor's hammer headlights right here, full LEDs with active high beams, and fog lights down below. An interesting twist is that the S90 has not yet received the matrix headlights that we see available in certain Volvo models, although honestly in the US they wouldn't do anything extra versus these headlights because the full functionality of those multi-pixel LED headlights just can't be utilized here because America's lighting laws are honestly pretty stupid. Volvo designed this generation S90 to support two different lengths. The short wheelbase version is basically the same size as the Audi A6 and the BMW 5 Series, and the long wheelbase version, well, that's kind of an oddity, because this slots between the BMW 5 Series and the BMW 7 Series in terms of length. This is 200.1 inches long. A 5 Series is currently 194.3 inches long. And that's because Volvo realized that the Chinese market wanted a bigger sedan. They wanted more rear seat legroom. And that's exactly what American shoppers tend to prefer as well. So Volvo decided to just simply give us the model that they had made for China. Interestingly enough, this one is also built in China currently. Rear seat accommodations are the big reason that you might want to choose this over a BMW 530i or a base Mercedes-Benz E-Class. We have considerably more legroom in the back, nearly 6 inches more combined legroom than the average mid-size luxury sedan, and that's why this rear door is so large. But the price tag, the width, and the styling and feature set of the S90 is definitely solidly mid-size luxury sedan. So this is not a direct competitor to something like the 7 Series or the A8 or the Mercedes in terms of its size, inside or outside, or in terms of the features, gadgets, performance, etc. As with most luxury vehicles in this segment, the rear-end styling of the S90 is pretty restrained. Some might call it a little bit sedate. One big change is that the S90 no longer has visible exhaust tips in the rear. We have sort of a little homage to an exhaust tip with some of the little styling elements here, but that's because Volvo is moving to an electric future, and they've decided that all their vehicles need to look exhaust tipless for some reason, so that way you wouldn't be able to visually identify the electric from the plug-in hybrid from the regular gasoline vehicles in the future. I kind of understand where Volvo is going with that, but I have to say I do prefer the lower bumper treatment that we found on the previous S90. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that on the trunk lid it said B6, not T6. That's because under the hood we get the new mild hybrid drivetrains that have been available in Europe for a little bit. Total horsepower comes in at 295, which is 15 less than last year, but torque goes up 15 pound-feet of torque to 310 pound-feet. The big difference between B6 and T6 is that this no longer has a belt-driven supercharger. Instead, it has an electric supercharger right under this little section of the intake manifold right there. It still has an exhaust gas-driven turbocharger in the rear, And the electric supercharger performs basically the same function as in the T6 engine. It helps improve boost at idle or just off idle. So when this vehicle stops the engine, this now has a more aggressive idle start-stop system. The integrated starter generator can give you 13 horsepower and 30 pound-feet of torque to help get things kicked off, get the engine started. Then the electric supercharger builds boost quicker, so that way you don't have as much turbo lag as you'd find in a regular engine with start-stop. And then after a specific speed, the turbocharger in the rear takes over. In addition to building boost more rapidly, the electric supercharger has basically no engine power loss when the supercharger is not in use. That's very different than a belt-driven unit. We then have a 48-volt battery over here on this side. The 12-volt battery gets relocated to the trunk. Fuel economy improvements are modest, but they are definitely there. 2 mpg in the city, 1 on the highway, and 1 more mpg in combined driving. If you're interested in a plug-in hybrid S90, it is still available. It's now called the S90 Recharge. That gives you over 400 horsepower from a modified version of the T6 engine that we had last year. So it still uses the belt-driven supercharger under the hood, not the one that we're finding in this model. It gives you a bigger battery in the tunnel and an electric motor on the rear axle. As you'd expect out of Volvo, front seat comfort is excellent. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a power extending thigh cushion. We still have a manual tilt telescopic steering column. I do find that one odd feature by the time you get up to the S90 or the XC90. I would really love to see a powered tilt telescopic design at some point in the future. We have a 2-position memory over there for the driver's seat and a 2-position memory for the passenger seat that has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat. Rear seat legroom may not be the reason to buy the S90 over the German competition, but it is certainly one of the reasons. With 82.6 inches of combined legroom, this is more legroom than we find in the current generation long wheelbase Lexus LS. I should say the long wheelbase version is the only version that they make of the LS currently. This is about 5 inches more legroom than we find in a 5 Series, and it is instantly noticeable. You can tell that just by the size of the rear doors, the large door opening for the rear passengers, and the fact that sitting right here behind myself as the driver, it's like 10 or 11 inches of legroom left. This is the kind of vehicle that you could very easily accommodate rear-facing child seats and tall adults up front. So if you're a 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", you could definitely put a rear-facing child seat up front with no problem. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks, and I still have about 6 inches of legroom left. This model also has 4-zone automatic climate control, a nice touch, heated rear seats, and power sunshades in the rear. For a little bit more of a limo-like feel, I can also use this little control on the door to scoot the front seat forward if I wanted to stretch out even further in the back. If you're the kind of person that's considering the Volvo over the BMW, the Mercedes, or the Audi because this is more child seat accommodating in the back, you should keep in mind that if you have the option to power control the front passenger seat, I could not find a way to lock that out of the passengers in the rear, so your kids might always be playing with that front passenger seat. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion rather than the 40-20-40 fashion that we find in some Volvo vehicles, but we do have a ski pass-through right here in the middle, softly padded center armrest with 2 cup holders located right there in the armrest itself. Behind the power trunk lid, we find 15.4 cubic feet of storage space. That's pretty similar to mainstream mid-size sedans, but oddly enough, big trunks aren't as important as they used to be, it seems, in the luxury segment. You'll actually find a considerably smaller trunk in the new Mercedes-Benz S-Class. A small amount of potential cargo area is taken up by the 12-volt battery that's been relocated over here to the driver's side of the cargo area. On the passenger side, we find a cargo net, a 12-volt power outlet, and then going all the way under the load floor, we find a unicorn for a European luxury vehicle, an actual spare tire. On the inside, we don't find too many major changes. Most of the tweaks are fairly subtle. We still find most of the active safety systems right here integrated into this module just behind the rear view mirror. A benefit to placing things like the radar sensor in this module is that if you're involved in a minor fender bender or if there's a lot of snow packed up front, the system will still function pretty much normally as long as the windshield is clear. We have some revised controls for the moonroof. This is now a touch slider right here, both for the moonroof operation and the shade. We also have touch buttons for the map lights, physical buttons for the telematics system. The sun visors do not slide. That's one thing that I wish Volvo would address in this model. We have a pretty large dual-pane moonroof, but you can see that the back pane is not quite a panoramic moonroof like you might find in some luxury vehicles. It goes to just over the rear passengers' laps, not their heads, but some of that also has to do with the size of the S90. Again, this has a pretty massive stretch, and if you take a look at these 2 windows, you'll notice that unlike most sedans in this category, the rear window is quite a bit larger than the front window. In this model, we get power shades for the rear passengers, and you can see that the rear seats are definitely very bucket-shaped in the outboard position. Moving over to the front seats, we have fixed in-place headrests, height-adjustable shoulder belts. There's a little Swedish flag on the front seats, just in case you're wondering where Volvo's headquarters is. These particular seats do not have a perforated center section. They are just heated, not ventilated. We have pretty aggressive bolstering, though, for the driver and the front passenger, and that bolstering extends out to the extending thigh cushion, as well as that major portion of the seat bottom cushion. As you'd expect out of a luxury vehicle, lots of premium materials happen on the dashboard and on the doors, lots of stitched material on the top of the door, a center perforated section right there, soft touch armrest, soft touch plastics down there at the bottom of the door. It appears a little bit grainy on the camera, but that's not all grain, that's actually the perforations on that center section of the door. We then have a little bottle holder down there at the bottom. The Bowers & Wilkins sound system is a pretty expensive option, but it's probably one that I would get. You can get the S90 with a few different wood trims and of course the metal trim that we have in this model. I personally think that the wood trim dresses up the interior a bit more. The stitching continues on the dashboard. We find lots of stitched materials going on there at the top of the dash, right there around the Bowers & Wilkins center channel speaker. And then dropping down the dashboard, we find the other big change for 2022, and this is the new Android Automotive operating system. The screen is a 9-inch touch LCD, which does seem a little bit small compared to some of the newer luxury entries, but keep in mind that the S90 is now about 5 years old and will probably get replaced shortly after the XC90 gets replaced. This software package was originally debuted in the Polestar 2. Volvo is a 49% owner of Polestar, the all-electric car company, and Polestar is sort of the tech incubator for Volvo. So this Google system, which employs online Google mapping interface, is pretty much the same as we find in that Polestar with some special Volvo tweaks. Now to the downside. Versus the Census system that this replaces, it is very snappy, but I don't find it quite as intuitive to use. Things are easy to pop up and somewhat intuitive here, like for instance the passenger seat has no additional options, so just pressing on that seat icon turns on and off the seat heater. But over here on the driver's side, if I press that same area, it pops up because I have a heated steering wheel as well. The screen size means that sometimes you can accidentally stab the wrong option, however, like I just did there for this 360-degree camera system option. This button right here takes you between that sort of home menu there and the last used app, which in this case is the Google Play Store. If I was on Maps, I would then toggle between that home screen and the mapping interface. The home button, which is just below that, it's a physical button, takes us to this home panel where I can then expand some of these options like the car status screen there, where I can click and I can go over to our Bluetooth media interface. But Bluetooth media does not bring us album art, you cannot browse your Bluetooth source, and no CarPlay is available just yet. Volvo says that CarPlay will be available later via an over-the-air update, but Polestar has been saying that for a while. Now, one thing that Volvo has fixed that Polestar is still lagging a bit on is Sirius XM satellite radio. We have that option now in this vehicle. The satellite radio interface is pretty much what you'd expect out of a modern satellite radio interface. We then have a Bluetooth phone interface, which is the only way to use Bluetooth right now. The Google Assistant system, so you can command the vehicle to do things like adjust the temperature, set your destination, etc. And of course, the connected mapping interface. The mapping interface is definitely very snappy, but we don't find any satellite imagery in this system as you do find in other Google connected systems. For me at the moment, this system is a bit of a work in progress. Android Automotive delivers a lot of promise, but so far we don't find as many integrated apps in here as we do find in some of the other implementations of Android Automotive, like for instance some of the new General Motors products. Over here we have some physical buttons for that infotainment system, rotary knob right there, some storage areas here. If I move that compartment up, there's a tiny little storage slot here, 12-volt power port. This roller cover, which you can see extends to all the way back there, that opens to reveal a Qi wireless charging mat, 2 large cup holders right there. You'll notice that over here we have basically the same sort of joystick shifter that we've seen before. It's still a double tap design. Double tap down there for drive, double tap for reverse. If we're in drive, then we tap once more to the back and we get a manual mode, and you toggle left and right for up and down. No paddle shifters are found on the back of the steering wheel. Behind that, we have a toggle for the engine start-stop button, but no drive mode selector anymore. Volvo says that few people were using the drive mode selector, so they decided to make the vehicle always operate in sort of an intelligent mode where it will decide exactly what you're after from the system and basically switch between more of a comfort or eco-focused program and sport based on your driving. Electric parking brake right there, auto brake hold, pretty large center console right there. A little bit deeper than you'll find in the plug-in hybrid model because there's no plug-in battery in there. 2 USB-C ports in here. One is marked with the smartphone interface icon, has a ring around there. That will be the one you'd use for smartphone integration like Apple CarPlay, but at the moment, we just have the cable there. And it's worth noting that at the moment in this infotainment system, there is no USB media interface. So if you have a USB media stick, you plug it in there, it does not appear to pull up anything. The new LCD cluster offers an interesting design. It has rounded corners here. It sort of looks like a NASCAR track. Over on the right side, we have what is sort of a tachometer, but you'll notice there are no numbers on there in any drive mode. It's hard to see on camera, but these top 2 dots are the red zone. Down there, we have the auto start-stop indication. On the other side, we have a speedometer with a very similar design. No numbers there, just a line that goes up, and then a digital speedometer on the left side. The display offers us really only 2 views. This one with a large map in the middle, and then one with no map at all in the middle. The steering wheel is a round, thickly padded design with small sport grips up top. You'll find the controls for the adaptive cruise control over here on the left side, the infotainment over here on the right side, and then these controls also double as controls to that multifunction LCD. So for instance, we use this button to change the view, this button to pop up that trip computer icon. We then have volume up, down, and then track forward, backward. There's a voice command button right over there, and then you'll find the reset button for the trip computer right here on the stock. Proving that there are multiple ways to get to good performance, this engine has exactly the same 0 to 60 time as the T6 that it replaces. I was a little bit surprised by that. I'd actually expected things to perhaps take a little bit longer due to the design of this system that no longer allows you to disable the auto start-stop system. You really don't have the choice. If you want the engine to not stop, I guess you could just crank down the AC. That will prevent the system from stopping the engine. But other than that, it's up to Volvo as to whether the engine is on or off from a stop. But since this is a mild hybrid, not a full hybrid, if I start to creep along slowly, it has to turn on the engine in order to move the vehicle forward. Then if I punch it, the electric supercharger in the B6 spools up quickly, and then it removes itself from the equation using just the exhaust gas-driven turbocharger. Likely because you can no longer disable the auto start-stop system, it seems that in some driving situations, auto start-stop is less aggressive at actually turning the engine off. As far as engine refinement goes, the 4-cylinder engine does feel a little bit more refined than the previous generation. It is a little bit less rough at idle in terms of vibrations in the vehicle, but it is still going to sound like a 4-cylinder engine. If I rev it up here, it'll still sound like a 4-cylinder. Now the big thing to know is that Volvo does not play a fake 6-cylinder soundtrack. They don't augment the engine noises through the sound system of the vehicle at all, like we do find in some of the competition. So on the one hand, I do find that more honest, but on the other hand, you are going to notice it sounds a little bit more gruff in the cabin than some of the BMW or Mercedes competition. In my testing, 0 to 60 happened in this model in 5.5 seconds. That's in the neighborhood of the BMW 530i, the base engine in the E-Class, and of course the Audi A6 as well. Keep in mind that those really are the direct competitors to this S90, even though theoretically this produces a bit more power than we find in the 530i. BMW, of course, tends to underrate their engines, so most likely the 530i is actually producing power that's a lot closer to this engine than its specifications would otherwise indicate. In terms of 60 to 0 stopping distance, keep in mind that this one had 255 with tires on it. It stopped in 109 feet from 60 miles an hour. That's definitely an excellent stopping distance. And you'll notice that out on the road, this handles more like the European competition than something like a Lexus ES, which is not far off this in terms of size, or necessarily price tag, or Acura's TLX. This is lighter than the TLX, you'll certainly notice that out on the road. And even though the TLX receives a double wishbone suspension in its latest generation as well, this double wishbone suspension feels more sorted, it feels more nimble, more communicative, and the entire vehicle feels lighter and more nimble. And that's kind of an odd twist, since the TLX on the inside is about the same size as the S60, and this is considerably larger on the inside. This doesn't really drive bigger out on the road. Now that said, when you start to push the S90 harder, it's obvious that you're going to have more fun in the BMW or the Mercedes. Those are going to have a slightly better weight balance, they're going to be able to send more power to the rear axle, and that will definitely give them different driving dynamics than the S90. The best way to describe the handling nature of the S90 is confident and predictable, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. This is just never going to be tail happy like you'll find in a BMW or a Mercedes that's rear-wheel drive. Out on a rougher gravel road like the one that I'm on here, I give the ride quality an A. This particular model has the 4C adaptive suspension system. This employs adaptive dampers and rear load leveling air suspension. Supposedly the reason the S90 does not get the full air suspension that we find in the XC90 is due to the front suspension design that varies a little bit from the SUV to this larger sedan here. The front end is just a little bit too low, and they didn't want to give this the proportions that would be required in order to fit the full four-corner air suspension. I actually think that's just fine, because in a sedan like this, the big reason you want an air suspension in the rear is for load leveling if you have more passengers in the back or more cargo in the rear. That prevents the S90 from needing springs that are as firm as would be required in order to support that kind of load all the time. So that can give the S90 a more supple ride, and it can firm things up a little bit when it needs to, but also have the load carrying capacity when the sedan is full. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 70.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. That makes this a little bit louder than some of the German competition. This does have 255 width tires all the way around, and some of the German options will have 245 width tires up front, or sometimes even slightly smaller tires up front. That may have something to do with the cabin noise, but I also suspect it has to do with the particular tires that Volvo has chosen, because most of the noise we get in the cabin is tire noise. Wind noise is very well controlled. While I'm talking about cabin noise, let's talk a little bit about engine noise. And I'm going to go ahead and put this in the manual mode and really rev things up, so hopefully you can hear it. This definitely has a 4-cylinder soundtrack. But what's different about this vehicle versus some of the European competition is that Volvo is not playing an imitation engine soundtrack or an augmented engine soundtrack over the vehicle speakers. So everything that you're hearing is the engine. And in a way, I find that a lot more honest than what we see in especially modern BMWs, where sometimes the engine sounds don't really seem quite right, and that's because they're not real. Over a week of mixed driving, fuel economy has been excellent with this engine. This one is EPA rated for 26 mpg. I've been averaging just over 26 at 26.5. That is obviously not as efficient as the plug-in hybrid version of this, and logically you won't get as good a fuel economy if you live in a hotter climate, where the engine is going to be a little bit less aggressive at shutting itself off at stoplights, especially if you're commanding a lot of cabin cooling, but it's still going to have an impact on your fuel economy. Technically, this mild hybrid system does give you some regenerative braking, but it is pretty mild. There's a little icon there that will tell you that it's regenerating power into the battery, but it's not going to regenerate a great deal of power into the battery, and when you take your foot off the throttle, most of what you're feeling is just engine braking. That's because the starter motor generator unit is pretty small, it's belt driven, and it is driven off the engine, so the power has to flow through the tires, through the transmission, to the engine, then across that belt, and then over to the starter motor generator unit. Volvo hasn't given me any specific numbers as far as braking force goes, but I suspect that in most mild braking situations, at least 98 to 99% of the braking that you're feeling is actually the friction brakes or the engine brakes in the vehicle, some combination of the two, and maybe 1 or 2% is the regenerative braking. This battery is fairly small, the electric motor is fairly small up there, and of course the supercharger, even though it is a 48-volt unit, isn't going to use a lot of power because it's not operating all the time. I know a lot of you out there are thinking, why did Volvo bother with such a micro-hybrid system at all, since this can't drive in electric-only mode, it doesn't have an electric air conditioning compressor, etc. Well, there is still a fuel efficiency benefit, and the cost-benefit analysis for a system like this is different than a full hybrid. This system costs less, and that means it's more affordable, and that's why Volvo is making this the standard engine in so many vehicles across the world. Another way to look at hybridization is that for a relatively small investment in batteries and electric motors, you can have a massive impact on carbon emissions and global fuel consumption. Because if every vehicle out there was at bare minimum a micro hybrid or a mild hybrid, whatever you want to call it, that actually has a much bigger impact on fuel consumption than just moving a few percent over to full battery electric. Now let's dive into the pricing. For 2022, the S90 starts at $51,850 plus destination, of course. That gets you the mild hybrid V6 system. All-wheel drive becomes standard. In other world markets, you can get the S90 with the less powerful version of the 2-liter turbo, but just over 300 horsepower is where it's going to start in the United States for now. If you want the plug-in hybrid, which does come with a federal tax credit attached to it, that will start at $60,650. But if you're interested in the plug-in hybrid, you might want to wait a little bit. We're not quite sure whether 22.5 or 2023 will bring the updated plug-in hybrid system, but it's not only going to give you longer range, it's also going to give you significantly more power. Power has basically been dialed up to 450 horsepower because the electric motor in the rear is going to deliver just under 150 horsepower instead of right around 79 horsepower or so. Now, let's talk about competition. The BMW 5 Series is clearly one of the best sellers in this segment, and it's a very direct competitor to the S90, even though the S90 is a little bit larger on the inside and on the outside. For me, at least, the best way to describe the 5 Series is as the Honda Accord of luxury sedans, and that's not an insult at all. The 5 Series is very good at pretty much everything. The electronics are good, it's comfortable, it's fast, it handles well, it performs well, it's fairly reliable as far as a European luxury sedan goes as well, and it comes in a ton of different flavors. If you're taking a look at a spider chart, the 5 Series is nearly a perfect circle. It doesn't excel in all the ways. It's not the most fuel efficient, it's not necessarily the fastest, it's not necessarily the best handling or the best feeling out on the road, but it does everything extremely well. The Volvo S90, on the other hand, is definitely more of a star on this chart. There are some areas where it really excels. For instance, the fuel economy, obviously the plug-in hybrid system, those are excellent. Value is very good in the Volvo. Seat comfort is good in the Volvo as well. But acceleration, handling, performance, etc., those are things that fall behind a number of the European competitors. Clearly, value is what separates the Volvo from the BMW, however. The BMW starts at $54,200. That gives you a rear-wheel drive 530i model. If you want all-wheel drive, remember all-wheel drive is standard on the S90, that's going to be about $5,000 more than the Volvo, and as you start adding options to your BMW, it's going to be even more expensive. So generally speaking, the Volvo should be $5,000 to $10,000 less expensive than a comparably equipped BMW 5 Series. If you want a plug-in hybrid 5 Series, that's going to be at least $57,200. That is a little bit less expensive than the Volvo S90 plug-in hybrid, and that's mainly because the plug-in hybrid system in the 530 is not as powerful. You will definitely get 0 to 60 faster in the S90. Now let's move on to the next competitor, the Mercedes-Benz E-Class. As with the BMW 5 Series, the Volvo S90 is only competing with the lower-end engine options in the Mercedes. And at the moment, there is no plug-in hybrid version of the Mercedes. Value is again the big win for the Volvo here. The E-Class will start at $54,590. It is one of the more expensive options in this segment. And remember that as you start getting excited with options on your E-Class, it is going to get considerably more expensive than the Volvo. Comparably equipped, you should expect to pay $10,000 to $15,000 more for the Mercedes than the Volvo. Now, when it comes to tech, I really love the things going on inside the Mercedes cabin. I think Mercedes has dialed things up to a level that Volvo has not achieved yet, especially with the new Google infotainment system. I think that's been a little bit of a miss for Volvo here. The lack of plug-in hybrids that we find in the German options can logically be explained by the fact that those manufacturers seem to be skipping plug-in hybrids in America and going to full-on electric vehicles. So next year we should be seeing the Mercedes-Benz EQE right around the same time that we're going to get the next generation of full EV products from Volvo, and of course BMW is going to be doing the same sort of thing. With that out of the way, let's move on to the next competitor, the Audi A6. The A6 is a little bit less expensive than some of the other German options and a little bit better value as well. It starts at $55,900. All-wheel drive is standard, as is a dual-clutch automatic transmission. Now, Audi's DCT is absolutely excellent, and personally, I prefer a DCT over a traditional automatic transmission, but keep in mind, it's still a dual-clutch, and it's not going to be as smooth. So if you value smooth shifts and a traditional automatic transmission feel, you might not want to get the A6. It's going to be $59,800 if you want the 3-liter turbo, and performance on that model is going to be approximate to what we see in the S90 with the current generation T8 plug-in hybrid system. The general design of the drivetrain in the Audi A6 is actually pretty similar to the Mercedes and the BMW, quite different from the Volvo, but because of its design, the engine is entirely in front of the front axle. So the bigger the engine that you have in front of the front axle, the more front-biased the weight balance ends up being. For most buyers, that is absolutely not a problem, but I point it out because some enthusiasts get upset if I don't. Next, let's move on to the Genesis G80, the other value option in the luxury segment, and the one that I think is more direct competition to the S90 in a way, because the Genesis and the Volvo both march to their own drummer. But the tune that Genesis is playing with the G90 is perhaps a little bit more similar to the German options, because this is a rear-wheel drive luxury sedan rather than something that's based on a front-wheel drive transverse engine platform. But when it comes to styling, technology, and the way the vehicle drives, the Genesis and the Volvo are probably the two that are a little bit outlying in this segment. The G80 has a definitely distinctive Genesis feel to it out on the road. It feels a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, perhaps a little bit more grown-up than the 5 Series or the E-Class. That's kind of an odd thing to say, of course, because this is a very grown-up luxury car segment. But the most compelling thing about the G80 is its price tag and its value proposition. $48,000 buys you a standard 300 horsepower 2.5-liter turbo engine and rear-wheel drive. You can get all-wheel drive on that model, and it's still going to be a little bit less expensive than the vast majority of the European options, especially when you start factoring in standard equipment and the very long standard warranty that we find in the Genesis lineup. If you want even more power, there's also a new 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6 available in the G80. The weight balance is pretty good. All-wheel drive is available on either engine, and you don't have to step down into older transmissions in order to get all-wheel drive like we see in the Lexus product portfolio. The interior design is absolutely excellent, and I do like the exterior design of the G80 as well. I really love the fact that Genesis went in a different direction with the interior design than most of the European competition, as we see in Volvo's lineup as well. In my mind, the best way to describe the modern Genesis lineup is as sort of a hybrid of classic Lexus attributes and modern Mercedes attributes just jammed into the same vehicle. Now let's talk about what my pick would be. Honestly, this is pretty tough for me. If you need the room, especially rear seat accommodation room, get the Volvo. It has a big back seat thanks to the extra length. If safety is the top of your priority list, also buy the Volvo. I love the Volvo safety systems, I love Volvo's dedication to safety, and personally I would trust them a little bit more than some of the competition here. Now if you're a gadget lover, I would certainly go with the Mercedes. I love the LCD instrument cluster, I love the LCD infotainment system, I love the way they work together and all the configuration ability that Mercedes gives us. Also, if you want just luxury gadgets and luxury features, I think Mercedes has pretty much everybody else topped in this segment. They have an excellent massage function in the seats, lots of gadgets, gizmos to choose from. If you want value and a long warranty, that's definitely going to be the Genesis. And if you want one of the best all-around vehicles, that's probably going to be the BMW 5 Series. It's hard to go wrong with that model. Now, if I were spending my own money in this segment, I suspect it would be down to the G80 or the S90, just based on my own personal preferences. I might lean towards the Genesis, but keep in mind, some folks have been a little bit disappointed by Genesis dealers. At this point in time, it's not an entirely separate experience from a Hyundai dealership, so if that is at all a concern to you, then you might want to skip Genesis and go with one of the more traditional luxury players. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and stay tuned, because hopefully I will have my hands on Volvo's refreshed plug-in hybrid system very, very soon. In the meantime, be sure and find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and of course, check out the merch store at aoamerch.com. I'll see all of you later.